December 8, 1941. Less than 24 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Pacific War entered a phase that few people inside Imperial Japan were prepared to imagine. As Japan expanded its military operations across Asia and the Pacific, one assumption remained absolute and unquestioned. Japanese soldiers, and especially Japanese women, would never become prisoners of war. Surrender was not just discouraged, it was considered a moral failure worse than death. Yet by the final year of World War II, Japanese women would find themselves alive in American custody, facing a reality that directly contradicted everything they had been taught about the enemy. At the start of the war, Japanese society was deeply shaped by a rigid code of honor. Military doctrine, education, and propaganda reinforced the idea that capture was shameful. This belief applied equally to men and women. By 1941, Japan had mobilized tens of thousands of women to support the war effort. Conservative military records indicate that more than 50,000 women served as Army and Navy nurses during the conflict, with thousands more working in communications, logistics, and auxiliary roles. These women were deployed across China, Burma, the Philippines, and island garrisons throughout the Pacific. From the moment they entered service, they were warned about the enemy. American soldiers were described as violent, undisciplined, and morally corrupt. Women were told that capture would lead to abuse, humiliation, or execution. As a result, many nurses carried poison or were instructed to kill themselves if capture became inevitable. Survival through surrender was never presented as an option. For the first 2 years of the war, these fears seemed justified by the intensity of the fighting. Japanese units rarely surrendered, and American forces reported extremely low numbers of prisoners. This reinforced the belief on both sides that capture was impossible. But by late 1943, the balance of power in the Pacific began to shift. American industrial capacity, naval dominance, and island-hopping strategy slowly dismantled Japan's defensive perimeter. As supply lines collapsed and evacuation routes disappeared, Japanese military planners faced a reality they could no longer control. July 1944 marked a turning point. The Battle of Saipan was one of the most decisive defeats suffered by Japan during the war. After weeks of intense combat, American forces overwhelmed the island. More than 30,000 Japanese soldiers were killed. Civilian casualties were catastrophic, with entire families driven to suicide by fear of American capture. Yet amid the destruction, American troops encountered Japanese women in uniform, Army nurses, who had remained behind with wounded soldiers after evacuation orders failed. These women were taken into custody under extraordinary circumstances. Many were injured, exhausted, and severely malnourished. They fully expected to be killed. Instead, they were disarmed, searched, and transported to temporary holding areas. According to U.S. Army medical logs from the Marianas Campaign, Japanese female prisoners received immediate medical attention, including treatment for wounds, dehydration, and disease. Food rations were issued according to standard POW guidelines. The psychological impact was profound. Interrogation reports from 1944 describe women who refused to speak, avoided eye contact, and physically trembled when approached by American personnel. Some repeatedly asked translators when they would be executed. The answer never came. Under American policy, prisoners were handled according to the 1929 Geneva Convention. Although Japan had signed the convention, it had never applied its protections to Allied POWs. The United States, however, enforced its provisions strictly. Female prisoners were separated from men, guarded by military police, and housed in secured areas. Abuse was prohibited. Medical care was mandatory. As the war progressed, similar scenes played out across the Pacific. In the Philippines during the liberation campaigns of late 1944, American units captured Japanese medical staff and civilian women trapped behind collapsing Japanese lines. In Burma, retreating Japanese forces abandoned field hospitals staffed by nurses who had no means of escape. In each case, American forces encountered women who believed they were moments away from death. Instead, they were fed. For many Japanese women, captivity was the first time they had eaten regularly in months. U.S. Army rations, though basic, were nutritionally sufficient. Medical care exceeded anything available to them during the final stages of Japanese control. In some camps, Japanese nurses were permitted to assist in caring for wounded prisoners under supervision, a decision intended to reduce unrest and utilize their skills. This treatment was not accidental. By 1944, American military leadership understood that humane handling of prisoners served strategic purposes. Intelligence officers noted that respectful treatment encouraged cooperation and weakened Japanese propaganda. Several reports explicitly mention that female prisoners became more communicative over time, especially when reassured that survival did not carry punishment. Yet despite this, shame remained overwhelming. Many women struggled to reconcile their survival with the values they had been raised to believe. Some attempted suicide even after capture. Others withdrew completely, refusing to speak for weeks. American guards and medical staff recorded these behaviors with concern, noting that psychological trauma often exceeded physical injuries. Then came Okinawa, April 1st, 1945. The invasion of Okinawa marked the final and bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War. Unlike previous battles, Okinawa was densely populated with civilians. Japanese military authorities mobilized students, including teenage girls, to support frontline operations. Among them were members of the Himeyuri Student Nurse Corps, schoolgirls assigned to underground field hospitals under artillery fire. As American forces advanced, Japanese defenses collapsed in chaos. Orders were inconsistent. Some units instructed civilians to flee. Others told them to die rather than surrender. When the front finally broke, American troops encountered groups of young women emerging from caves, wounded, starving, and terrified. Once again, the same pattern repeated. Captured Himeyuri nurses were not executed. They were transported to civilian internment camps. U.S. Army medics treated their wounds. Survivors later recalled receiving food, blankets, and medical care. Several post-war testimonies describe American soldiers offering chocolate or cigarettes, gestures that deeply confused girls who had been taught to expect cruelty. By the time Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, the United States held approximately 130,000 to 140,000 Japanese prisoners of war worldwide. Women represented only a small fraction of that number, but their presence challenged deeply rooted assumptions on both sides of the conflict. Repatriation began in late 1945. Most Japanese women were returned to Okinawa or mainland Japan by 1946. For many, the hardest part of the journey was not captivity, but returning home. Families believed they were dead. Communities viewed survival through capture with suspicion. Silence became common. Their stories remained buried for decades. And this is where the story truly begins to reveal its meaning, not just as a footnote of World War II, but as a lesson about propaganda, reality, and the human cost of ideology. As these women returned to Japan in late 1945 and throughout 1946, they re-entered a society in ruins. Cities were destroyed, food was scarce, and the moral framework that had shaped pre-war Japan had collapsed almost overnight. Yet one idea remained deeply ingrained. Capture was shameful. For Japanese women who had been prisoners of war, survival itself became a burden. Many chose silence, Others altered their personal histories, telling neighbors and even family members that they had been evacuated earlier or hidden during the fighting. American records from the occupation period indicate that former Japanese women, POWs, were rarely discussed publicly. U.S. authorities focused on demobilization, reconstruction, and political reform. Their goal was stability, not revisiting uncomfortable wartime realities. As a result, these women disappeared into civilian life with little acknowledgement from either side. What makes their experience particularly important for historians is how it exposes the limits of wartime propaganda. Japanese women had been taught that Americans were monsters. American soldiers, in turn, were taught that Japanese forces would fight to the death and that civilians might be hostile or suicidal. Both assumptions collapsed in the presence of vulnerable, terrified young women emerging from caves and field hospitals. This did not mean the American military was free of brutality or moral contradiction. The Pacific War was one of the most violent theaters in modern history. But the treatment of Japanese women POWs shows that American policy toward prisoners, especially by 1944 and 1945, was guided by strict regulations and long-term strategic thinking. Compliance with the Geneva Convention was enforced not only for ethical reasons, but to encourage surrender and demonstrate moral contrast. U.S. intelligence summaries from the final year of the war reveal that humane treatment of prisoners was considered a psychological weapon. Officers noted that Japanese soldiers who learned women were being treated humanely were more likely to surrender. This created a powerful incentive to maintain discipline and restraint, even in brutal combat environments. For the women themselves, the contradiction was deeply personal. Many later recalled feeling gratitude mixed with guilt. Some expressed confusion at the kindness of people they had been taught to hate. Others struggled with trauma for decades, unable to reconcile survival with the deaths of friends who chose suicide instead of surrender. In Okinawa, survivors of the Himayuri Student Nurse Corps later became some of the few women willing to speak publicly. Their testimonies, recorded in the decades after the war, describe not only the horrors of combat, but the strange relief of capture. They spoke of American doctors cleaning wounds carefully, of guards preventing civilians from harming themselves, and of being told, often for the first time, that they were allowed to live. These accounts challenge simplistic narratives of World War II. They do not deny suffering, nor do they glorify war. Instead, they reveal how ideology can distort reality, and how human behavior under structured rules can differ radically from expectations shaped by fear. By the 1950s and 1960s, Japan began to confront its wartime past more openly. Yet even then, Japanese women POWs remained largely absent from textbooks and public memory. Their story did not fit the dominant narratives of heroism, victimhood, or sacrifice. They were neither martyrs nor soldiers in the traditional sense. They were survivors of an experience their society had never prepared them to understand. Today, historians estimate that only a few thousand Japanese women were ever held as POWs or civilian internees by the United States. Their numbers were small, but their experiences carry disproportionate significance. They demonstrate that war is not only shaped by weapons and strategy, but by belief systems, and that when those beliefs collapse, reality can be deeply unsettling. In the end, these women did not return home as heroes. Many returned quietly, anonymously, carrying memories they rarely shared. Yet their stories remain a powerful reminder that even in total war, moments of restraint can exist, and that propaganda often fails when confronted with lived experience. Their disbelief was not weakness. It was the shock of discovering that the world was more complex than they had been taught, and that survival itself could become an act of quiet defiance against ideology. Thank you for watching this documentary. And now I'd like to ask you, what country are you watching from?